George R.R. Martin has pulled off the seemingly impossible. He's made it okay for so-called nerds to talk about dragons, sorcerers, and imaginary kingdoms in public. His epic fantasy book series, A Song of Ice and Fire, is massive. 22 languages, 15 million books sold worldwide, and the basis for the breakout TV series, Game of Thrones. Time magazine has called him an American Tolkien, and the world of fantasy really doesn't get bigger than that. So, growing up in a federal housing project in Jersey, George was actually a fan of Tolkien, and he started writing himself at an early age. He sold monster stories to other kids for a penny a page, was already a successful author and TV writer the day that this image popped into his head. It's the opening scene to Game of Thrones. And while the books and the TV series might have brought him riches and acclaim, George has also faced the wrath of outraged fans because it can take him about 5 years to write a book. And they've hit him hard online, berating him for doing anything that isn't writing the next book. But they'll just have to be patient. See, George has 2 more books planned in the series. And in the meantime, the Emmy Award-winning series is coming back to HBO Canada.
Power is a curious thing. Who lives? Who dies? Power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall.
Fire, blood, war, and 3 great men. Who will live and who will die? Please welcome to the show, Joe Roman!
Hey. Good to see you. Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome, sir. Not bad for a guy who wrote on Beauty and the Beast, huh?
Beauty and the Beast, Twilight Zone.
That's right.
Even episodes of Max Headroom that were never filmed. So
That's
I have
incredible.
a very checkered past.
Well, you know, and you also you get to explore really complex morality in these stories. And a great fantasy should really be about talking about the world in a bigger sense. You're doing that, aren't you, in this stuff?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly trying to do that. Yeah, that's always been one of my goals. I mean, I love fantasy. I grew up reading science fiction. I grew up reading fantasy. I love Tolkien. I read him when I was in junior high school. He had a profound effect on me. He's the father of all modern fantasy. We all are working in the shadow of the great mountain that is Lord of the Rings. But that being said, Tolkien did certain things that are different than what I would do. And in the hands of some of the Tolkien imitators, those things have become cliches that I think have ultimately harmed the genre and made people think that it's entertainment for children or for particularly slow adults. And all this stuff about the Dark Lord is rising in the north, and the good guys have to get together to fight him. Handsome guys in white cloaks fighting really ugly guys who dress all in black. The battle between good and evil, that's fine. The battle between good and evil is a universal theme, not only for fantasy, but for any fiction.
Right.
But my opinion has always been that the battle between good and evil is fought within the individual human heart. All of us have the capacity for good. All of us have the capacity for evil. The same people have the capacity for doing that on different days. You read about war heroes who save their whole platoon and are incredibly brave, and then they go home and they beat up their wives, or they become an alcoholic, or they become a thief and things like that. How do you reconcile that? Well, they're human beings, and human beings are endlessly fascinating to me. And the fact that we do have good and evil in us, that we can be angels or we can be monsters, and how do we make these choices? How do we go through life? And that's the stuff I love to wrestle with.
You were a conscientious objector.
I was, yes, during Vietnam.
What was that process like? I mean, you would have seen firsthand the complexity of humanity right there.
Actually, it was surprisingly easy for me. Oddly enough, I know a lot of guys who tried to get CO status during Vietnam and who were refused it. You probably know some of them because many of them became Canadians.
Yes, they are. We welcome them.
When they were turned down, yes. Back then it was said that most draft boards, and all the draft boards were local, they would not give you a CO status if you objected to Vietnam. They would only give it to you if you were a complete pacifist and objected to all wars. And I was not a complete pacifist. The big question they would always ask you is, would you have fought in World War II against the Nazis? Well, yes, I would have fought in World War II against the Nazis, but the Viet Cong were not the Nazis, and I didn't think America had any business in Vietnam and so forth. So I was objecting to that particular war, and everyone told me, well, you'll never get the CO status. But oddly enough, I did get the CO status, and relatively easily. And I learned later that my draft board was so conservative that they felt, well, anyone who wanted the CO status should have it, because then he'll be branded forever as a yellow-bellied coward and a traitor, and his life will be ruined, and that would be enough punishment for him. So
thank God for that.
So they ruined my life, and there I am. And I still think the Vietnam War was a terrible mistake for America. But I still would have fought against the Nazis.
Yeah. Do you work that kind of political belief system into the work?
Well, I don't do it deliberately. I mean, I'm not writing an allegory. Nonetheless, my beliefs certainly permeate some of Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones. Part of it being my belief about war and violence, which also enters, I mean, things like Beauty and the Beast and my television work and all that. You know, working in network television, we were under constant pressure on a show like Beauty and the Beast to have more action. We had, you know, in the view of the network, we had too many women watching the show and not enough men. We had to get more men. How do you get more men? You have more action. Action is network speak for violence. Right. But bloodless violence. You know, we weren't allowed. Vincent was actually going out and ripping people apart with his claws. He was disemboweling these people and slashing their throats open, but we weren't allowed to show a drop of blood. Right. Because that would disturb people. That would be violence. We can't show violence on television, but we should show lots of action, you know? And, you know, we love, like, car chases and things like that. Well, if you've ever been in a car that's wrecked, it's a horrible, traumatic experience. There's, you know, disorienting, and the metal is screaming and clashing, and people sometimes die very painfully and bloodily, and yet we watch this for this bloodless entertainment of cars flipping and turning, and it's the same way, I think, in fantasy. War is so central to fantasy. So much of high fantasy, and yet it's these bloodless wars where the heroes are killing unending armies of orcs, and the heroes themselves are not themselves ever being killed.
You kill everybody all the time, man. You fall in love with a character and they're dead.
It's true. I mean, I'm guilty of killing people, but you know, I think if you're going to write about war and violence, then show the cost, show how ugly it is, show both sides of it. There's also, I mean, and on the other side, which sometimes gets me in trouble from the other side of the political spectrum, is the glory of war, which those of us who are opposed to war and would rather not have war, tend to forget about or try to pretend it doesn't exist. But if you read the ancient historical sources, people are always talking about the glory of war, the banners that stirred the heart, the banners in the wind. But then after the battle was finished, there would be like severed limbs everywhere and pools of blood. You read descriptions of the Hastings battlefield after the Battle of Hastings were fought. And yeah, there literally were like streams of blood and giant pools of blood. There's a lot of blood in a human being. And when you're fighting with these sharp swords and hacking off limbs and, you know, hacking people in the middle of the head, it's not a bloodless exercise.
It's going to come out.
And yeah, it's going to come out. And I think if you're going to write about that period, then you should reflect honestly what it's about and capture both sides of that.
A big part of that conversation in the history of war is directly tied to religion, and there is a school of thought which suggests once a Catholic, always a Catholic, regardless of how lapsed you are.
Yes, I'm pretty lapsed.
Are you pretty lapsed?
Yeah, I'm pretty lapsed, yeah.
But there's lots of ritual in that as well, and there's a lot of ritual in your work. Does some of that sort of feed in?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think, you know, your experiences as a child will shape who you are, and no matter how much you're intellectual will reject them, you can't ever completely escape them. You know, I mean, even though I stopped going to church when I was in college, you know, which is now like 50 years ago or so, and have been a lapsed Catholic since, you know, when I still, like, I read about the wars of religion or something, it's like I'm almost rooting for the Catholics because I'm on Team Catholic against, you know, Team Puritan or something like that. That old loyalty still somehow kicks in. Nice. And I wish, like, Notre Dame would do good again in football. So.
Well, listen, for a guy who has trouble writing, apparently, when your team loses, you won the Super Bowl, so I should expect three books in a million times.
Go Giants.
Stick around. We're going to talk to George a little bit more. And also, so much of his success is based on you as the fan, so we'll get into the fans. More with George R.R. Martin right after this. George R.R. Martin. So, you know, obviously The Simpsons with the parody, we've talked about it in the break, you know, Chuck, Big Bang Theory, Castle, a lot of people...
Right, I've done these shout-outs to Game of Thrones. It's cool. It's very cool.
You have this really interesting relationship with your fans in that you let them in your life, you let them know what you're doing. And I've seen fans be angry at writers before, but I have never seen people get as angry as they get at you because you take your time to write a book. They get pissed off at you if you do a renovation in your house.
They have, yes. I should be entirely devoted to writing this one series of books that they particularly like.
How do you feel about it?
You know, it irritates me. I mean, I think we all would like to be loved universally and have everybody think we're the greatest things on sliced bread. I try to put it in proportion, and, you know, I think 99% of my fans are fabulous, and I get far more supportive letters saying, take as long as you want, you know, we love your work, the books are great, thank you, thank you. But the occasional negative letter that comes in, even though it's vastly outnumbered by the good ones, can be irritating, and the trolls who, you know, I mean, I have to moderate my blog now, which I never had to do in the early days, but it just reached a stage where if I didn't have it moderated and cut things, it would just be overwhelmed. And it wouldn't be just me. I mean, someone would post a negative message, an attacking message on the blog, and then like 3 or 4 of my fans would, the fans on the side of light and goodness, would come rushing to my defense, and then the trolls would start attacking them, and then suddenly there would be hundreds of messages of the fans fighting with each other, even without me posting one thing.
All in this. They know how to do it because it's all in this.
Yes.
There's one thing that's also really interesting about your books I notice is that you write women really well. You write them really different. I know your wife is obviously a strong influence in your life. Where does that come from?
You know, I've always considered women to be people.
Obviously, you have.
You know, one of the hardest things as a writer is to write someone who's not yourself. I mean, the easiest fictional character to create is one who's exactly like yourself. So when I'm writing, and I have characters who are quite like me, in my Wildcard series, the great and powerful turtle, Tommy Tudbury, is practically me without the major telekinetic superpower, which I wished I'd had as a kid, but I didn't ever actually develop. But he lives where I live in Bayonne, New Jersey. He lives in the actual project that I live in. The view out his front window was the view out my front window. So I've really mined my biography to create the great and powerful turtle. But when you're writing fantasy, I've never been a prince, I've never been a king, I've never murdered anyone, I've never been a dwarf, I've never been an 11-year-old girl. So, you know, the question is, how do you write these characters? Well, there's a certain amount of stuff that you have to get by doing research. You have to talk to people who actually have had these experiences. Like when Bran was crippled by his fall, I had a couple correspondences with readers of mine who were paraplegic and had no use of their legs, and, you know, described to me some of the consequences, some of the things I might not have thought of, and made suggestions to me of how better to write that. And I certainly took that sort of stuff into account. But then the main thing is empathy, and saying, well, okay, how would I feel? Because the character is still a person. There's a certain basis of common humanity. And that's true when writing about women or writing about a dwarf or writing about any of this. You have to start with the basis. They're more like me than they are unlike me.
Right.
They have some special condition that they have a different set of genitals than I do, but it's still the same old story, a fight for love and glory, right? We all want kind of the same things out of life, and that humanity can motivate characters and make them real, and that's what I try to remember at all times.
All right, now, I don't want to do a spoiler thing here, but have you given any thought to this R+L=J theory about Snow's bloodline?
I make no comment on that. No comments about Jon Snow's mummy. Have to keep reading the books for that.
Very good. Season 1 of Game of Thrones is available. It's on Blu-ray and DVD. It's now, but you have to cram it all in because Season 2 of Game of Thrones appears April 1st on HBO Canada. You can also see behind-the-scenes Game of Thrones stuff at the Bell Lightbox in Toronto. A lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, it's an amazing exhibit that they have down there.
Absolutely. Go down to Lightbox and you can check it out. And, of course, you can get all the books as well. Good to see you, man. Thank you so much for coming in.
See you.
George R.R. Martin, everybody. We'll be right back. George R.R. Martin has pulled off the seemingly impossible. He's made it okay for so-called nerds to talk about dragons, sorcerers, and imaginary kingdoms in public. His epic fantasy book series, A Song of Ice and Fire, is massive. 22 languages, 15 million books sold worldwide, and the basis for the breakout TV series, Game of Thrones. Time magazine has called him an American Tolkien, and the world of fantasy had war in 3 great men. Who will live and who will die? Please welcome to the show, George R.R. Martin.
Hey.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome, sir. Not bad for a guy who wrote on Beauty and the Beast, huh?
Beauty and the Beast.
It really doesn't get bigger than that. So, growing up in a federal housing project in Jersey, George was actually a fan of Tolkien, and he started writing himself at an early age. He sold monster stories to other kids for a penny a page, was already a successful author and TV writer the day that this image popped into his head. It's the opening scene to Game of Thrones. And while the books and the TV series might have brought him riches and acclaim, George has also faced the wrath of outraged fans because it can take him about 5 years to write a book. And they've
Twilight Zone.
That's right.
Even episodes of Max Headroom that were never filmed. So
That's
I have
incredible.
a very checkered past.
Well, you know, and you also you get to explore really complex morality in these stories. And real great fantasy should really be about talking about the world in a bigger sense. You're doing that, aren't you, in this stuff?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly trying to do that. Yeah, that's always been one of my goals. I mean, I love fantasy. I grew up reading science fiction. I grew up reading...
Hit him hard online, berating him for doing anything that isn't writing the next book. But they'll just have to be patient. See, George has 2 more books planned in the series, and in the meantime, the Emmy Award-winning series is coming back to HBO Canada.
Power is a curious thing. Who lives? Who dies? Power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall.
Fire, blood.